and thanks for inviting me to this really convivial day. It's been a joy to hear such great papers on SER and BSR amongst Seresians. It's a great deal of thanks for that. Now, in this paper, I'm proposing to explore a juncture between the work of Michel and Jean-François Lyotard, centering on a scenario which both of them entertain. It's the end of the world. In Serre's case, this solar catastrophe represents, or rather must represent, since he never explicitly says as much, a de facto termination of the natural contract he proposes between humankind and nature, a terminus ad quem in the legal register which contractual matters invite. For Lyotard, this solar catastrophe actually need not represent the termination of the human project at all. He's not, of course, proposing a natural contract, though he envisages its continuation in a fashion which is liable to preserve from it only the inhuman aspect which pervades that very project. The points of connection I'm going to offer are by no means equally weighted for both authors, but they all bear on substantial themes in their work, such as the nature of technology and information, certain exceptionalism in human evolution, thermodynamics and entropy, a standpoint on finitude, this is my particular interest here, and an affiliated distancing from the idea of humanism. In exploring the connections, my intention is to throw fresh light, if I can, on the idea of the natural contract itself and to draw some tentative conclusions from this exercise in comparison. To preface the discussion, a few observations are due on the scenario chosen for the point of intersection, the end of the world. Firstly, while it certainly serves as a limit case, the terminus ad quem, to the notion of the natural contract, it may also serve as the most concrete element thereof. Nobody ever signed Hobbes or Rousseau's social contracts, nor were they ever formally drawn up. To do so would almost be to miss the point. This is a fact not lost on Serre, nor indeed on the generality of political theorists who've chosen to write on the topic, who himself, Serre, happily embraces it and accepts the same status of political fiction for his own natural contract. He says in the natural contract, virtual and unsigned like the first two contracts, Hobbes and Rousseau, we assume, since it seems that the great fundamental contracts remain tacit, so here we have, by his own words, a great fundamental contract, the natural contract recognizes and acknowledges an equilibrium between our current power and the forces of the world. So if the great fundamental contracts may never legally and politically, an emphasis on legally and politically, achieve any more than fictional status, albeit one we can live by, the predicted end of the world is a good deal more concrete. Let's just note that for Lyotard, as for Serre, the coming solar catastrophe and our situation in the energetic economy of nature more generally not only demands a reframing of our attitude, but presents an imperative to reevaluate just what counts as thinking, judgment, decision-making within the exchange between nature and humankind. Lyotard says, while we talk, the sun's getting older. It will explode in 4.5 billion years. It's just a little beyond the halfway point of its expected lifetime. It's like a man in his early 40s with a life expectancy of 80. With the sun's death, your insoluble questions will be done with too. It's possible they'll stay unanswered right up to the end, flawlessly formulated, though now both grounds for raising such questions, as well as the place to do this, will no longer exist. You explain, it's impossible to think an end pure and simple, if anything at all, since the end's a limit. And to think it, you have to be on both sides of that limit. So what's finished or finite has to be perpetuated in our thought if it's to be thought of as finished. Now, this is true of limits belonging to thought, but after the sun's death, there won't be a thought to know that its death took place. So that rather stroppy passage is from the Inhuman. Those familiar with the debate over speculative realism will recognize here some of the key elements of Von la Lettre. Lyotard is arguing that faced with the unthinkable solar catastrophe to come, those who cling to what Meillassoux calls correlationist thinking will be inclined, or perhaps obliged, to refuse admission to that catastrophic thought into the body of what we call knowledge. Why? Since demonstrably that which can have no correlate in human thought or cognition, anything beyond human finitude, must be placed in epistemic suspension. At its strongest for Meillassoux, this amounts to the ontological formula, if you can put it that way. To be is to be the correlate of human experience. This kind of formulation serves to truncate any account of natural phenomena acting independently of human purview, and to render claims about the far future or far past all but unsustainable. And this he identifies, Meillassoux, as the fundamental flaw of correlationist thinking. And this is kind of what Lyotard is doing. He above, like Meillassoux later, is effectively critiquing the same standpoint. Faced with an upcoming solar catastrophe, an exterior real, the correlationist principle not only lacks traction, but positively works to short circuit any adequate response. I had developed a passage bearing on Ashley Woodward's discussion of this connection to speculative realism, but I'll simply allude to it and encourage you to read it. It's in The Inhuman Condition. It's Lyotard and the Inhuman Condition. Now, you could note also that some similar impasse is dramatized in Serre's Natural Contract with the combatants in the mud. Their combat eclipses this exterior real to which they have then no access, since they stay within the social contract, perhaps, rather than the natural contract. Lyotard addresses the solar catastrophe scenario at some length in the first few essays of the collection The Inhuman, and in his postmodern fables most extensively. But where does Serre do the same? In fact, to my knowledge, it's only in one place, Hominescence, and more or less confined to one sentence. He says, yes, the global human, the one who now communicates with the four corners of the horizon, beyond the seas and the emerged lands, whose neighbor answers from the other hemisphere, the one whose behavior affects the hole in the ozone layer, thousands of kilometers high, and whose nuclear work has consequences that will endure for millions of years. This very human has any but one project before his light ashes will melt into the air: immortality. So that's a funny kind of immortality. It's got an expiry date. I grant that there's some license here required to organize a comparison of the two thinkers around a scenario with such an imbalanced textual weight. But I would argue that we should view this short passage as a kind of leap in place for Serre, serving to reconfigure all around it while touching nothing, akin to those short story writers who reveal at the denouement, at last I saw that ghost was myself. Why? Because it contradicts, I would argue, habitual principle we see in operation, knowingly and deliberately adopted throughout Serre's work, the principle of decentering. He claims in The Incandescent, we now laugh at the revolutions that change center so often, and which we call decenterings, whether it's a question of the earth or the sun, or the subject or the object, or the self and the non-self. These distinctions are of no matter, since they all and always presuppose the center. Whatever position that may be assigned to it, whatever name may be given to it, and whatever movement it may command, again from The Incandescent. Our own Christopher Watkin brings out this theme of decentering in Figures of Thought, which I have found useful very often, thank you. He locates this principle and elaborates on its emphatic nature for Serre, as early as the Système de Leibniz. Rather than relocating the fixed point from one celestial object to another, Serre commends the Leibnizian approach of not negating Copernicus's revolution, but generalizing it to infinity, in order to discover that everything is center in its own way, yielding a world infinitely centered, decentered in a system which Serre describes as Ptolemaic Copernican. Everywhere is an earth, sun, variable and unvarying, moved and fixed, distinct and confused, which is as much to say that decentering is then a figure of thought for Serre. What might we expect then of Serre's movement of thought with respect to the ultimate ecological threat, the solar catastrophe? Some speculation, perhaps, on some practical technological implementation of the decentering of the human seat in ways, in ways which would only parallel that conceptual Copernican decentering of anthropocentric culture already effected so long ago, a diaspora to the stars of some kind. A scenario so well established in literature, descending from his beloved Jules Verne science fiction, that to fail to countenance it seems willful. It would count, surely, this diaspora as another casting off, or rather blasting off. Indeed, so much more pronounced is the lapse in this principle here when we consider the thought experiment at the beginning of the Incandescent, published only 2 years after Hominescence, specifically dramatizing the embrace of cosmic tracts of space and time to include in our restricted human gaze the increasingly inhuman scales in which we partake and to which we should feel we belong. He says, just as with their mechanical science, Copernicus and Galileo reversed our old perceptions of the terrestrial movements around the sun. So, filled with wonder at this new change in duration, you now contemplate a tiered series of clocks whose wheels, some of which are slow, stars and mountains, others incredibly fast, the little girl and the doll, count time, each wheel within it with its own rhythm, or rather its own tempo, swift to the pleasure of the gaze, and almost motionless to its blindness. Is that the wrong way around? Yet for all this adventure in thought, this thought experiment, the only sense of foreshortened, embodied immortality humankind may contemplate, according to Serre, lies not out among the stars, but in between today and the day of annihilation. This is an aspiration doubtless central to the ecological message. Any possible immortality for the global human, Serre describes, is doubtless predicated on the sustainability of the planet as long as we stay here. Bound up with the attunement, the contract with nature, the relinquishment of war in the broadest sense, which he espouses. Throughout Hominescence, Serre refers in various ways to the Earth as a house. He speaks of our, meaning all species, common house. When he posits a homo universalis, it's as the occupant of our globe. Chapter 13 is entitled The End of Networks, the Universal House. In chapter 3, Serre outlines 3 global houses, which are to be understood as underpinning the global society. These are those of the material energetic world, he says, string theory. That of information encoded in DNA generally, and of the organism in general, and that of the banks of data and information we've amassed. All 3 in context are aspects of our house, all terrestrial, notwithstanding, let's say, the ubiquitousness of the material energetic fabric of nature. In all of this, he's seemingly submitting an answer to the question he poses in the natural contract. Are we more citizens within our city walls or of the starry dome? While he is encouraging us to see the world in a grain of sand in the Incandescent, his position in Hominescence seems more to align with Shakespeare's Hamlet, so famously reluctant to act, than with William Blake's mystic vision. Hamlet famously says, "Oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself king of infinite space." So you don't have to move to get there. Let me be clear, I'm not suggesting that the future possibility, uncountenanced in Serre's work, maybe he just didn't think of this diaspora to the stars, should have served to supersede for him. I'm not suggesting that it should, nor that it should nullify the cares and concerns of the natural contract, as though when we've despoiled this planet, we should flit without guilt before expiry date. I am rather outlining a tension inherent to Serre's position. Why effectively concede a terminus ad quem clause, or leave it there, to the natural contract when the incandescent vision to extend it, to decentralize its purview, is so eloquently inscribed within your own body of work? Is this down to a shift in perspective between the writing of Hominescence and the Incandescent? My suspicion is to the contrary, but maybe we'll pick that up in the conversation. And while I'm making cultural references, One of Woody Allen's short form stand-up punchlines helped to lay out the contrast between Lyotard and Serre. Allen recounts an episode in which his friends console him. They say, "Stop obsessing about death. You'll never die. You'll always live on in your work." To which he replies, "I don't want to live on in my work. I want to live on in an apartment in the Upper East Side," which is what obviously Lyotard would like to do. Lyotard has a different answer to the question of immortality and indeed the post-human condition. He proposes that the fate of the human project, the human system, is to live on, not figuratively, but literally somewhere among the accommodating niches identifiable out among the starry dome. This will be achieved, he says, on pain of retrofitting itself, that is the human project, to the new terrain. The choice of phrasing is deliberate here. It's not humanity, which will live on in Lyotard's scenario, but the human project, the technological avatar of humanity, and this less by design than by fate. The key to this long-term future lies in the interconnected roles Lyotard assigns to technology, evolution, and information. I'll deal with each of these under separate headings. Firstly, technology. Lyotard shares with Serre a conception of technology, here most saliently for him the kind of technology which might allow us to quit this world, is similar in kind to Serre's exo-Darwinism, with one important caveat. He sees technology as no different in kind to the organism. Indeed, in important ways, technology is constitutional of the organism itself. He says, you know, technology wasn't invented by us humans, rather the other way around. As anthropologists and biologists admit, even the simplest life forms, Infusoma, tiny algae synthesized by light at the edges of tide pools a few million years ago, are already technological devices. Any material system is technological if it filters information useful to its survival, if it memorizes and processes that information and makes inferences based on the regulating effect of behavior. That is, if it intervenes and impacts on its environment so as to assure its perpetuation at least. As such, Lyotard sees the problematic at hand, as given by the title of his chapter, the survival of thought beyond the destruction of the planet, as not essentially different in kind to the survival of the smallest organism in its own microclimate, its own pool. Secondly, evolution. Given the scope of the definition of technology above, it's relatively easy to see why technology is at the heart of the evolutionary story for Lyotard. Technology's stated role is to filter and process information from the environment to assure perpetuation. He would agree with Serre that the advanced state of evolution achieved by humankind, the human system in his case, offers not merely security against the threats inherent in the environment, the regulation of survivable temperature, for instance, in the development of systems for heating and cooling, security against the dangers inherent in getting lost, in the development of geolocating technology, and so on. All those factors which refer not to required bodily adaptation to the environment on the part of the human organism, such as growing thicker hair, for instance, but to the management of those factors by prosthetic enhancement. Again, this jibes harmoniously with what Serre calls exo-Darwinism and de-differentiation. There is, however, a strikingly additional layer to Lyotard's analysis. It is that this exceptional circumstance, this human exceptionalism in the stakes of evolution, is spurred on by an overarching goal. He says, you, humankind, decide to accept the challenge of the extremely likely annihilation of a solar order and an order of your own thoughts. How can that order survive is the question. And then the only job left you is quite clear. It's been underway for some time. The job of simulating conditions of life and thought to make thinking remain materially possible after the change in the condition of matter that's the disaster. This and this alone is what is at stake today in technical and scientific research in every field, from dietetics, neurophysiology, genetics, and tissue synthesis, to particle physics, astrophysics, electronics, information science, and nuclear physics. Whatever the immediate stakes might appear to be, health, war, production, communication, for the benefit of humankind, as the saying goes. The markedly similar emphasis both writers place on immortality. For certain global citizens, it's only but one goal, any but one goal. There's a bit of franglais there, but any but one goal. It's your own goal, their only goal. And for Lyotard, there's only one job left to you. So they both place the same emphasis, although, of course, we remind ourselves, Sir has an expiry date. So this last phrase, for the benefit of humankind, that we've just heard from Lyotard, is ironic, since Lyotard explicitly sees in this techno-scientific convergence towards a successful perpetuation as threatening to the aspects of the human project which make us human: health, production, communication, even war. These are the illusory values of humanism which are increasingly to be retrofitted into a dystopic caricature of themselves, subject to the convergence of techno-scientific performativity. Health becomes a matter of human resources in the name of the kind of efficiency orientated toward perpetuation of the human project, which favors the inhuman and which commandeers all local battles in the name of a global war against an indefatigable entropic curve. And again, to underline, this epic battle Lyotard describes is not steered by human design. As Lyotard has it, there's little to no choice in this techno-scientific destiny. It's already almost covertly, ulteriorly underway, as he says. Thirdly, information. There are significant correspondences between Lyotard and Serre with respect to the notion of information, which nevertheless serve to reveal important differences. For both, information plays a role in global society in three significant ways. Firstly, in the form of the stock of information which we have as a species gathered and recorded, which has been increasingly been converging on a standardized format, the digital. This stock of information is one of the global houses, indeed, that Serre identifies in Hominescence, along with DNA and the physical energetic fabric of the universe. Alongside this and allied to it is the communications technology, which collapses distance and shortens time. Lyotard comments, if we are to interrogate properly this compulsion to communicate and to secure the communicability of anything at all, objects, services, values, ideas, languages, tastes, which is expressed in particular, we must, I think, give up the philosophy of the emancipation of humanity implied by classical modern metaphysics. All technology, beginning with writing considered as a techne, is an artifact, allowing its users to stock more information to improve their competence and optimize their performances. Again, that's the Inhuman. While Serre acknowledges certain discomfort or disorientation, which the newly realized global society may cause, particularly with respect to the communication revolution, this globalization is for him not inherently dystopic as it is for Lyotard. The collapse of distance and time, not chiefly a matter of performativity. The global society is for him characterized by a transition, perhaps chiefly characterized by a transition from geometrical parcellation of life, towns and fields, to a topological ubiquity, where every point connects with every other. And he says, the universality of new humanism isn't merely due to the power we've acquired from attaining the global through the energy of the atom or the information of science. It also isn't due to the all-powerfulness in the sense of totipotency recognized in our bodies and our understanding, but also, and above all, to the expanse that we now inhabit. Distanceless space implies a spaceless I. We no longer inhabit geometry, the earth, or measurement, but a topology without metric or distance, a qualitative space. And that's Hominescence. Among the benefits this can bring, argues Serre, is the easing of the suffering of long voyages and the alleviation of homesickness. He speaks of contacting one's neighbor in the other hemisphere. The stock of information, which is one of the new global houses, presents for Serre a step towards the realization of the encyclopedia. By contrast, again, Lyotard rather warns of a new barbarism or illiteracy, poverty and immiseration in his techno-scientific dystopia. Thirdly, third aspect of information, it's for neither thinker is it the sole preserver of the thinking human being. For Lyotard, this is chiefly a function of recording or capacity for memorization inherent in communication technology. He develops this idea with respect to the Leibnizian notion of the monad, first highlighting the connection between the monad and information. And then we can understand this connection in terms of features which Leibniz specifies of that monad. Anthony Beevers notes, since monads are individuated from each other on the basis of differences in what they perceive, they can be conceived of as information-based agents. Again, that's from Ashley Woodward's book, Lyotard and Inhuman Condition. This is derivable from Leibniz's tenet that each monad mirrors the entire universe, but each from its own point of view. They all have different information. For Lyotard, this has the consequence that the convergence of global informatics into an increasingly unified techno-scientific system of systems. Again, this is derivable from Leibniz's picture of the nesting nature of monads, the minor nesting within the major increasing at increasing scales, up to God who enfolds all. So that convergence onto a unified techno-scientific system of systems for Lyotard implies that the resulting inhuman presence is de facto the largest monad to which the human project has given rise, and that as such it's best fitted, not us, it is best fitted for the diasporic journey to the starry dome. In my opinion, we can start to see a kind of black mirror version of Serre's own position in what Lyotard says. It is, let us recall, for Serre, only on the encounter with planetary objects, on the realization of their existence, that the new pan-subjectivity required to adhere to the natural contract comes haltingly into play. Much like the acquiring of object permanence that we find described in Freud and so on. But this at the level of pan-subjectivity. The role played by the planetary object for Serre is for Lyotard the prospect of solar catastrophe. That's how it plays out. But the subjectivity to which it gives rise is the techno-scientific inhuman. Likewise, for Serre, information and communication is not the sole preserver of the thinking human being. We know this well. Indeed, this is the basis on which we are able to predicate the natural contract in the first place. In fact, he says the earth speaks to us in terms of forces, bonds, and interactions, and that's enough to make a contract. So, and here's where Serre recasts the humanist story. It's not with the political or the legal that we can effect the pact with nature. Indeed, he says, those humanist verities serve in themselves to obscure the communication possible. Those are the combatants in the mud. The communication possible between ourselves and nature. We have to learn to think as nature does in terms of forces, bonds, and interactions. We have to learn to cast off. And if both thinkers meet at the level of the global, the planet itself, they're looking out from antithetical viewpoints, characterized nowhere more than on the principle of communication. Lyotard says, referring to the supervention of a disenchanted techno-science over a prior version of science, which Serre would call Venusian, Lyotard says, once we were considered able to converse with nature, capital N. Matter, capital M, asks no questions, expects no answers of us, it ignores us. It made us the way it made all bodies by chance and according to its laws, from the Inhuman. For Serre, of course, there's no inert matter. There's no disenchantment. All event is an inscription, like shadows moving over the blank page of sand. And I'll just finish with a quotation that I'm sure you all know very well. Just to fix the point. The world gives itself to be seen by the world that sees it. This is the meaning of the word theory. Better. A thing intervenes in the world so that the world can be read, can read on itself. The writing it traces on itself. How much time have I got? Okay, to wrap up. finitude and infinitude really falls out of this for me in a way that is quite antagonistic between the two viewpoints, and it's a theme that's often touched on in Hominescence, perhaps particularly for Serre, but also works with Lyotard. Has two meanings. Finitude for Serre is finitude in contradistinction to totipotency, but it is also elsewhere in his text, it is also there's a sense of infinitude of language that can refer to an exterior real. Indeed, is the speaking of an exterior real, which is of the interest to me here and marks the contrast.
We've got time perhaps for one question or comment. I wasn't sure whether you just had waving your finger.
Not me. I'm not sure I was actually going to ask a question. If I can try.
You are now.
This would just be to ask to see if you can connect up a couple of points that I was hearing.
Yeah.
Sort of there. Being rich. Thank you. There's the question of finitude and infinitude as you just cast it at the end in terms of totipotency for Serre.
Yeah, I think it has both terms.
Earlier, in terms of the relationship to the end of the world, it would seem to be cast in terms of future and our relationship to the future.
Yeah.
I wondered, is there a way in which these two characterizations be achieved?
Well, yes, I mean, yeah, we're talking about, and in terms of the Mayasuian critique, it's a matter of Kantian constraint, any constraint on our situation, our organism, indeed, our senses, is the finitude of which he speaks. And I think certainly the blowing up of the planet would count as one element of that, yes. So in other words, we don't have forever to work out what we think as well. That is genuinely, I think, something that Kant would speak of as finitude. So how does that relate to this other sense? So if we speak of finitude, then the correlationist critique of that finitude is that we are restricting ourselves unnecessarily and unwarrantedly to an understanding, an epistemic understanding that will not uncautiously allow talk of anything far in the future or anything long in the past, because these cannot be correlates of human experience. At best, they are deduced from a long chain of possible experiences, and so there's inflections of that position, all of which are unsatisfying to Meillassoux. I agree with Meillassoux' critique. I don't agree with Meillassoux' solution one jot. So what I'm trying to do is find good infinitude and bad infinitude, and basically sifting through it, and we have bits of it in both Lyotard and Serre here. Serre perhaps simply because he's kind of, when it comes to pragmatic matters of getting off the planet when it's blowing up, you know, he doesn't even consider it, and he should do. It's part and parcel of, it's the logic of his argument. Yeah, indeed. But nevertheless, quite clearly, there is no conversation, there is no possible meaning inherent in things for Lyotard, whose inert matter doesn't speak back to us. Well, for Serre, it certainly does. And in that sense, we have one picture of what infinitude might entail that is encapsulated well in Lyotard, who seems not to be able to put a plan together based on it. That's kind of where I'm at. But Lyotard, who can put a plan together, seems to accept a rather moribund sense of how that could work, and indeed what is a kind of reified sense of entropy and complexity, and these are things that are being done to us. And of course, the next step is, well, you're doing a grand narrative, aren't you, there, Lyotard? Which he's kind of wary of, and this is Ashley takes us through that bit where he talks about the critiques, those critiques whereby Lyotard is accused of that kind of reification. Oh, you know, everything's running down all the time, everywhere. That's what you think entropy is, and it's not as though nature selects for complexity at all times. And these are from Ansel Pearson, and actually runs us through them. They are there to be had, and I agree. And I don't think Serre does anything like that kind of reification. But Lyotard wants to, if you like, insulate himself a bit from that charge later in postmodern fables after the Inhuman, whereby he says, you know, all I'm really doing is weaving the worst scenario I can possibly drum up to scarify for present concerns about technologization and, you know, this techno-scientific dystopia that's just looming. It's happening. We need to resist it now. So so he undermines his own status, but actually, to be honest, I mean, unpostmodern and pretty much non-fabulous is how I take that scenario. It's going to happen. And whether or not it's a clever thing that he said at one point, it's a thing that we can worry about because it's going to happen, you know. So I'm taking his scenario, possibly counter his voice, his own voice, maybe not, as literally as he apparently intends it in Inhuman, because you can do so.
I think we are going to have to.
Okay,
Thank
right,
you.
thank you.